Huh. Vishnu was supposed to send me an introduction, but that hasn't happened. So I'll conjure something up. But they say friends shouldn't introduce friends because very often that leads to the loss of friendships. So pardon me for anything silly I might say here onwards. But Vishnu,
I'll take the apology in advance. You're forgiven.
I'll just, before we start off, I'll just request everyone who's got their video on to just turn their video off, so that we can have more bandwidth and there's no stoppages along the way. Cool, thank you. So I know Vishnu for a few years now. I met her. So right after college, actually, I really wanted to do something that was related to wildlife. And so it was Vishnu and Shashank who kind of took me under their wings and introduced me to frogs in general. So the first thing I learned about Vishnu was that she's an excellent mentor, and really, really good at teaching you about frogs, and really, really open to learning new things about everything around in nature. And so so in this project, like we all stayed together. We moved from one city or one town to another along Karnataka's Western Ghats. And very often we saw lots of new frogs, which were new to each other also, like all of us together. And so it was just sharing those moments, and you come to learn about how Vishnu just is really nice and genuine person, and really good at what she does, which is all things nature. Although she'll tell you multiple times she's not a naturalist, she's pretty natural at it, and she really if you just spend some time listening to her about things she likes, like frogs, you'll understand how much she cares about those creatures and everything about them. And yeah, so I let her do the talking. A more formal introduction would also mean she's done her MSc from NCBS. She's doing her PhD now on frogs as well. She looks at how frogs, how in agroforestry kind of environments, how management practices and things affect frogs and their existence, and how they're, how humans and frogs are in some way or the other interrelated. And we'll touch upon that as we go along as well. So over to you, Vishnu.
Thank you so much, Ramit. That's an incredible introduction. You were too complimentary. Yeah, so I just wanted to go over one thing. We'll go over questions at the end. I think you can all type it down on the chat box and we'll read it and then I'll respond to you. And also, hold on, let's see, I need to share my screen so you can all see it. Can you see the screen, everybody?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for this opportunity to Delhibirds to be able to talk about my favorite group of animals, amphibians, and for Amit for participating in this and joining the chat. So yeah, I think Ramit, you need to start asking the questions.
Yeah, that's true. Yes. So, so actually, it's interesting. I never asked Vishnu this question. So the first thing I would like to know is, how did you get interested in frogs? Where did your love of frogs start from? Yeah.
So my love for frogs, if I think back on it retroactively, it's really hard to figure out at what point in time in your own life history that you suddenly fall in love with this group of animals. But I feel like even as a very young child, I was always drawn towards herbs. So I would always run around and try and watch like lizards and frogs and snakes and anything that was basically a herb. Like I was never one of the brave kids who would go pick them up and things, but I would always go stand next to them and watch them quietly. And I think that kind of interest came very early because I remember like birds and mammals and stuff were pretty. I looked at them, but they never somehow innately drew the same amount of curiosity and excitement as reptiles and amphibians did. But I think it was somewhere in undergrad years that I really realized that amphibians were the thing. I had to do a biodiversity project for my undergrad. And I decided to do it on frogs in the area I was living in, which is this beautiful 100-acre campus south of Bangalore, the Valley School campus. So I did a biodiversity amphibian assessment of that area. And then I started realizing, wow, there's this incredibly beautiful diversity of frogs. I don't know what they're doing. And, they have these really interesting, huge throat sacs that they use for vocal sacs for calling. And I just didn't know anything about frogs. So it was really interesting to do that. And around that time, I also visited Agombe, which is this beautiful mid-elevation site in the Western Ghats that has such an incredible diversity of herbs. It's raining amphibians and lizards and snakes. And in the monsoon, it's raining heavily. Yes, it's South India's highest rainfall region, but it's also so incredible for herbs. And I also got introduced to other people who were really excited about it. And then actually Dr. Gururaja is here and got an opportunity to work with him at ISE, volunteering on projects. We went to Dandeli. So basically my early experiences in the Western Ghats just blew me away. And it was the amphibians that really caught my attention. So yeah. And I also find them fascinating. They're such an interesting group of animals naturally. So I'd like to do a quick introduction on what amphibians are, so we all have an understanding of it. So amphibians basically is this incredible group of animals, if you think about it. They're sort of like a bridge between fish and reptiles, because fish live entirely in water and reptiles live largely on land. They're fairly terrestrial for the most part. And amphibians are this unique in-between, where half their life cycle is in the water and half their life cycle is terrestrial. So just for that reason, I think they're really cool. But also there's such a beautiful diversity. They're colorful, they have lovely patterns, they have everything that you would expect beautiful birds or charismatic mammals to have. So in my personal opinion, that I think that's why I'm drawn to them. So this here, the bottom two is the group that many of you will easily be familiar with. They form this group called frogs and toads. And I'm sure most of you have seen multiple species around your backyards. And they're very closely related, frogs and toads. Mostly toads have drier, wartier skin, but otherwise they're fairly similar. But the other two groups that you see up there are more interesting. The one on the right on top is not an earthworm. I know it looks like one, but it's actually a Sicilian, which is a limbless amphibian. It has no legs or any limbs. And they live underground most of their lives. So typical to most underground species, don't really have much of eyes. They don't need vision, and very good diggers. So, and they like really wet, moist soil. So almost anywhere in the Western Ghats, at least, you go and in the monsoon, dig a little bit or just walk along really wet regions, you'll see them on the soil. They're really beautiful, even though they look like earthworms. And the last group on the top left is a group called the Salamanders and Newts. We don't have much of diversity in this group in India. We have, I think, 2 species in the Himalayas. But the great diversity of this is in Europe and in the Americas. And I'm so fortunate that coming from one of the world's highest hotspots for frogs, which is India and the Western Ghats, I'm now in the world's hotspot of salamanders in Pennsylvania in the US, where I'm doing my PhD. And in the state I'm in, we get to see something like 20 species of salamanders. And over the years of doing field work with my friends here, I've seen more than 10 species of salamanders, which is incredible. It's great fun.
Yeah. Vishnu, you mentioned how India is a hotspot for frog species. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering, is it possible can you quantify for the people here exactly how diverse
India is.
India's amphibians are. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a difficult question because for the simple reason that we're still figuring it out for the most part. Like so much is unknown about India's diversity. But let's go over broadly. Whoops, what just happened? Oh yeah, right. Before I start on India's diversity, I'd like you all to look at this slide and tell me how many species you think there are on this slide. You can maybe type it on the chat box. It'll be fun to hear different answers. Okay, apparently I can't see this chat box until oh yeah, I can. Okay, so there are, I think, more amphibian biologists here than I expected. Yes, one is the right answer. So this is actually a group. Sorry, yeah. So this is a single species of bush frog called Rajasthan glandulosus. What is the common name, Ramit? Do you know? Glandular bush frog?
Glandular bush frog. Yeah.
We'll wing it. Something like that, right? Yeah, so this amphibian is incredibly diverse. It has so many morphs, right? Like, look at it. It looks like it has leopard patterns, spots. It comes in green, yellow, brown. Like, it's amazing. And this is just one species. And we have so many of these incredible amphibians in India. But so basically, this is a general map of India's biogeographic zones. And if you think about amphibians, like what I already said, they are species, they are a group of animals that require water for a part of their life cycle. So basically, you're going to find them at their greatest numbers in really wet regions, which for us in India is the Western Ghats, the Northeastern Himalayas, some part of the Terai plains in the Western Himalayas as well, below the Western Himalayas. These are the areas that you'd expect to be more specious, and they also happen to be global biodiversity hotspots. Western Ghats is a known biodiversity hotspot, so is the Eastern Himalayas. And the third is down here, just below the Eastern Himalayas, falls under the Indo-Burma biodiversity hotspot. And these areas are the most specious. We have over 430 species of amphibians right now identified, and that's, I think, still the tip of the iceberg. We have so much more to discover, and most of the discoveries, like if you see, have just been in the last 10 years or so, maybe 15 years, but actually just in the last decade, I think, I don't know, somebody who does taxonomy work and is more in track of species discoveries would be able to tell better, but like maybe over 100 species described over the last 10 years. So we have a lot more to find. And I think now Western Ghats is starting to be pretty well studied, but like the Eastern Ghats, for instance, is probably another great hotspot. It's not going to be as specious as the Western Ghats because it's not as wet and doesn't have as many habitats, but it's still going to be an incredibly diverse region, and we don't know how many species are there yet. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see. Maybe 10 years from now, we'd have settled taxonomy and know actually how diverse Indian amphibians are.
450 is a pretty huge number to think about. And yes, one of the things I remember as a kid, my only memory of frogs really as a kid is chasing toads outside my grandfather's house in Haryana. And then, I moved to Manipal, and then I found the same toads over there, and then to Bangalore and the same toads over there. And then there's frogs like the indigo bush frog, which is found on a single peak in the Western Ghats. Why is it that some frogs are all over the country, and then there are some frogs which are found in like really tiny parts or have an exceptionally small ranges?
Yeah. That's amazing that species can adapt to these different things, right? Like if you look at what you just asked, the common Asian toad, according to IUCN, this is its insane distribution. Like, look at that. Can you even imagine a little animal that has very poor dispersal abilities, which means it can't move large distances, it can't colonize new areas, has this distribution that goes over like half a continent, like the entire Indian subcontinent and most of Southeast Asia? Like, how likely is that? So, in my personal opinion, I think this is many, many species. We just don't know how many species of this, what we now call the common Asian toad is. And I think many people have started, like, for instance, some of the geckos in India that have like countrywide distributions have recently been found to actually be multiple small species that live in little patches of India and have distinct distributions. And so we'll soon find out that this common Asian toad, Dattatreya, will also be multiple species. But even given that these are multiple species, it's still incredible, right? They share most of their DNA. So they're very similar, even these multiple species. So you'd think they'd have very similar adaptations. So this guy who lives in the Western Ghats may be a different frog from the guy who lives outside your backyard in Delhi or Bangalore or Kolkata or any like major city in India. And they all have very distinct climate, habitats, all of that. But it's able to adapt to all of that. Even if they are different species, they're so closely related, how they're able to adapt to everything. And that's what makes a good generalist and a good colonizer. I think if there are birders here, you'd understand like species like Asian koel or red-whiskered bulbul are generalist species, right? Like they can adapt to any kind of habitat pretty much. And that's what's amazing about species like this toad, which can, you give it a little patch of like a pond, even a puddle of water, essentially, where it can breed and have tadpoles. And it's going to be able to survive everywhere from like evergreen forests to dry deciduous to scrub to urban landscapes. They're just good at adaptations. So like there's so many of such generalists, like the Indian bullfrog. Nick was showing me a picture of it earlier that he saw right outside Delhi earlier today. And other frogs like some of the narrow-mouthed frogs from Euperidon and things like that, or spherothekas, they have like really wide distributions. It's possible they're multiple species, but even given that, they're just really good adapters. They're able to survive in very different kinds of habitat. That's what makes them really successful. But on the other hand, like you said, there are species that live in like this much area of the world. And I'm going to go over a couple of them now. The first one is this beautiful night frog. It's called the Dattatreya night frog, named after a shrine in the Baba Budan Hills in Chikmagalur in Karnataka. And this frog it's incredible. Like, look at its like global distribution. In the entire world, it's literally like in that little dot out there. And that's it. That's the only location it's found in. And what's crazier is if you look at like a map of that region. So this is the Bhadra National Park and Tiger Reserve. And so all this light brown out here that you see along my cursor are the higher elevation shola patches. And then immediately around them is a bright green. So somewhere in this landscape is where this frog survives. And even if it's able to use up the entire habitat available to it, this ridgeline is like less than 50 kilometers long. And what's crazier is it's a strictly stream-dwelling frog, which means not only does it have only 50 kilometers of land to live in that land, there are streams, and that's it. So even if the number of streams run into thousands, that's basically all the habitat it has. So it's a very, very, very small, strict portion of area that this frog's adapted to. And these are basically what you'd call specialists, species that are adapted to such extremely specific habitats in such narrow ranges that that's all they can survive in. And they've also probably been geographically isolated from their nearest relatives to have become so uniquely different that they're a species that only exist in that little space. So yeah, this is one example of a crazy species like that. And another example is the resplendent bush frog, which was described pretty recently from the Anamodi peak, which is the highest peak in southern India. So that's this little dot here. And this is in Erviculam National Park and Tiger Reserve. And its known distribution is between 2,500 to 2,800 meters, which is literally the uppermost, tiniest portion of, like, this is the highest elevation left in the Western Ghats, and that's all there is to it. And if you look at this one's distribution, even assuming that it's able to use most of the shola grasslands that are visible to you, which is the grass hills, part of the Annamalai Tiger Reserve, and most of the brown portions in Erevikulam National Park, this area, it's still a very, very narrow distribution, right? You'd accept that this frog has very little habitat of this nature, basically beautiful grasslands up in the mountains. And what's crazy to me is that most species survive and continue to exist and not go into extinction because they adapt, they colonize, move into new areas and expand. And in a world where there's climate change, so we know it's gonna get warmer, we know it's gonna get drier and wetter in parts, more floods, more fires, all of this. And what scientists have agreed on what species are likely to do in a world of climate change is they're likely to move their distributions northwards, latitudinally in the northern hemisphere, and elevationally to higher elevations to adapt to thermal tolerances that they're used to. So most any species in the world, they're adapted to a certain weather condition, a certain climatic pattern. And since it's warmer now than ever, they're going to find the similar climate either more north or more up the mountain. And this group of frogs, the resplendent bush frog, for instance, is already at the peak of the mountain. It's already at the highest, like 2,500 to 2,800, the highest available elevation in the Ghats. So it has nowhere to go unless it leaps up into the sky. It really has used up as much land as it can. So it's going to be really challenging because the two species I've shown you with incredibly narrow distributions happen to fall within India's tiger reserves. It's a case of tiger reserves actually providing conservation benefits to these smaller creatures like frogs. It's not always the case. Many species do have most of their distributions outside tiger reserves. And so habitat loss is a huge threat. But in this specific case, no matter how many tiger reserves you declare or how much land you protect, yes, the habitat is saved, but climate change is not going to stop inside tiger reserves. It's going to get warm inside tiger reserves too. And if we don't have solutions for climate change, we don't know what's going to happen to these extremely narrowly distributed species.
A scary thought. Vishnu, so all these bush frogs, I mean, I know from our project, one of the things that fascinated me most was bush frogs, and I don't see them around Delhi. I was just wondering, so why is it that they inhabit all of these areas in the Western Ghats, and what makes Western Ghats so special for these frogs, or vice versa, essentially?
So the bush frog genus Rauchestus is found across, I think, South and Southeast Asia, but they've kind of like explosively radiated in the Western Ghats for some reason. So we have how many species? 60, 70 odd species in the Western Ghats of just bush frogs. And I think one of the reasons is this elevational patterns that we have in the Western Ghats, that some species are just over. One of the theory is glaciation events, right? When the world froze over during ice ages, a lot of the higher elevation habitats become unusable for species like amphibians, and they come down to lower elevations, where there's panmixia. So all populations that were up in the mountains are now able to breed and mix with each other. And then ice age ends and they all start moving back into the mountains, and then they get isolated into patches. So from one mountaintop, like say one shola grassland to another shola grassland or another shola forest patch, is essentially like a sky island with sea in the middle. There's just no way for them to get across these areas. And so they've become incredibly diverse by just the fact that they haven't been able to breed with each other and have become isolated and have so they've evolved into new species over time. And they've also like very interestingly like used some other niche things. Like if you look at the bush frogs, they're able to use everything from ground, like herbs on the ground, all the way up to treetops. Like they've used multiple levels of the canopy almost. So if you like think about the famous niche studies with warblers in the Americas and things like that, like there's almost like this beautiful layering that reduce competition. So even though it's so diverse, and any site you go in the Western Ghats has anything from 5 to 15, 20 bush frogs, they're still able to survive and adapt and compete because they have like really beautiful niche partitioning.
Cool. Speaking of frogs, I wanted to ask you, how do frogs communicate and talk to each other?
Yeah. Well, most frogs are nocturnal, so they're active at night. And if you think about it, the best way to communicate in the darkness is through sound. And so vocal communication is the most common form of communication with amphibians across the world, but definitely in India. So one example that I'm going to talk about right now is this beautiful Malabar tree toad, which lives most of the year on treetops. We really don't know anything about what happens throughout the year, but there's this short window, pre-monsoon or early monsoon, where they come down from their treetops into Myristica swamps to breed. And essentially they do these loud choruses where all the males are holding onto territories and calling simultaneously, loudly. And so I'm gonna show you a little video that our Mr. Ramit Singh recorded. Of this story. So you can hear even in the time that it's not calling this particular individual, you can hear just the sheer volume of sound all around. It's because those many individuals are all shouting at the same time. I mean, if an entire population has a week or two to breed in, they're all going to be trying to do that, right? So there's just this enormous chorus of males going on. So that's an incredible auditory noise, but they're still able to find each other and successfully mate, apparently. So this is one example of how vocal signaling is how amphibians find each other. And the other one actually is a group of diurnal frogs, or the dancing frogs of India. Most of you know about this, I'm sure. You've seen it in the media, you've seen people talk about it. But this group is probably the only group of amphibians that I can think of in India that are active not in the day, in the night, but in the daytime. Also, they are strictly stream dwelling, so they're usually found in fast flowing, loud, noisy streams where the water volume is pretty high and the sound of water is pretty noisy. Given that, and also the fact that they're high density breeders, which means in a small patch of stream, you find several individuals at the same time. So when those many amphibians are trying to scream for mates at the same time, when the water is that loud, it's almost impossible for conspecifics, other individuals of the same species, to even find each other, figure out which individual is where, because there's just such a din, right? And so they've adapted visual signaling. They do things like foot flagging, they do leg tapping, things like that. So what you'd usually find if you walk along the stream in the Western Ghats is that you'd find multiple males holding on to little territories, either on top of rocks or areas of the stream, usually, that they hold onto and defend. And one way that they defend is using this visual signaling. They literally kick their leg up into the air and wave. And it's pretty cool, right? Like the only reason this such a strange dance would have evolved is that they're diurnal. Imagine there was another species that lived in a noisy environment at night. Like there is no point waving. Nobody's going to see you. But because they've been active in the day, this group of species could evolve such an interesting and unique behavior that helps them communicate and find mates and repel competitors, other aggressive males, just by waving in the air. So yeah, so these are audio communication for the most part, and occasionally visual communication is how amphibians find mates and interact with each other.
Yeah, dancing frogs are way too cool. And speaking of things like moving your legs or waving them at mates and competitors, frogs do come up with ingenious solutions all the time. And I was wondering if you can shed some light on all the cool things that frogs do. Well, cool to us, and just lovely evolutions and things.
Yeah. Yes, I think frogs have incredibly interesting adaptations, right? Like you literally think of any species of frog that you know about in the world, and you can find at least one incredibly cool thing that it's adapted to. And the first of those that I'm going to be talking about is probably what most people consider is one of the prettiest frogs in India, is the Malabar gliding frog. And it's incredible that these species have adapted to live on treetops. And when you're up there in canopy, it makes sense to be able to get long distances between branches or from one bush to another. And so here is a frog that has adapted to be able to passively glide. I mean, it can't fly, so it can't like take off from a lower branch and fly to a higher branch, but it can passively glide really long distances. And so I think the agroforest can like glide about 12 meters, something like that. Yeah, so it's pretty cool that they can move to such great distances, and that's because they have webbing between their feet that act like sort of aerodynamic balance that lets them move. So a lot of other species, like there are gliding squirrels, there's a gliding lizard called Draco. There are all kinds of arboreal animals that have adapted to sort of passively glide through the air. And this is one of those that it's a little frog, but it can actually glide like 12 meters or more just passively through the air by the use of their folded skin. That's one pretty cool adaptation, I think, for locomotion. But most of the other really interesting adaptations comes back to mating, reproduction, finding mates, and things like that. So if you look at this, another night frog, I think Nyctibatrachus patreus, it's one of the more northernly distributed amphibians in the Western Ghats. There are other species like this, like the Jogue night frog as well. And they do something really cool. They're stream dwelling mostly. But what they do for breeding this species particularly is it finds like branches, rock surfaces, leaves that overhang the stream. And so the water is directly below, and it'll find such perch sites. The males will go sit on there, and they will call and advertise for females. And females who want to mate will come, mate with the male, lay her eggs, and leave. And he'll continue to sit there, guard his eggs, and keep calling again. Another female may come, mate again, leave eggs, and leave. And this can happen many, many times. So if you actually look at any point in time, you'll see clutches of eggs that are in different stages of development. So like in this case, you can see that there are actually the egg clutch on the left is pretty different looking from the ones on the right. And that's because they've been laid on, say, different days at different times. So there are different stages of development. And it's a case of male parental care, at least at the egg stage, that here's a male frog that's sitting here defending a territory, taking care of his egg clutches, keeping them moist, and guarding over them. So that's pretty cool because like they'll have to go find and search for sites that have this overhanging ability where the eggs can then hatch and the tadpoles fall straight into water, which they need for survival. And another night frog is this Baracus grandis. It's a beast. It's so big. It's the size of like my entire hand. And this one likes to breed in rock crevices in slightly bigger streams. And this was a really interesting situation that actually Shashank found in Coorg. So this pair, what happened is when the female came to mate with the male, he was sitting in his little rock cave and advertising. When the female came, he actually first tested the roof of his cave to look for moist areas that he thinks would be ideal for oviposition, where the female can lay her clutch of eggs. And then he sort of guided her to that spot where he wanted her to lay the eggs. And then if you look at this picture on the right, she literally does a handstand. She gets up all the way vertical like a real yoga master, and she lays the eggs up on the roof of this little rock crevice. And once she does that, he will then do the same thing to fertilize the eggs, which is pretty crazy, right? That they can do this handstand and get into that position. And he'll also make sure that he guards the eggs. And this is probably the only frog I know that actually is actively trying to defend himself. So when you try and put your finger near him, he opens his mouth and actually like sort of tries to scare you, which is hilarious. He's a frog, but he doesn't seem to realize that he can't really attack a human being. But yeah, it's the only amphibian I have ever witnessed that sort of like tries to threaten a predator or what he perceives a predator. There is another species of frog like this, the Kumbara night frog, again in Karnataka. I didn't find pictures. I don't have pictures of this species, but it does something even crazier. Like it lays eggs along branches and like fallen debris on stream sides that I've seen. And it literally picks up mud from the ground and kind of smoothens it over the egg surfaces, almost like a layer of plastering on the eggs, and which is such an insane and amazing adaptation, right? Like a potter, like to have evolved something like that is pretty great, because if you think about it, one, it provides camouflage when it's on the ground covered in mud. You don't really see it. But two, it prevents the eggs from desiccating and drying up, because the mud will make sure that the moisture is retained and the eggs remain healthy. And then when they hatch, they can fall into the stream and survive in the water. But until then, this is such a good way of making sure that the eggs remain moist and camouflaged and safe. So yeah, this group of night frogs, to me, although they're pretty brown looking and most people might not find exciting, I find incredibly exciting because they've evolved such crazy strategies to mate and take care of their eggs and young ones. Other adaptations like this is with all the gliding frogs that we were talking about earlier. Like, look at this. This is straight up an orgy. There's one big female that you can see here, and she's surrounded by, like, I can see about 5 males out here. And so these guys actually find treetops, branches overhanging ponds and puddles and streams or any water below. And they lay this giant foam nest, which probably has several hundred eggs. And these foam nests are often stitched between leaves, and they've like scouted positions on top, which is like directly below this water body, so that when they've mated and had their foam nest, when the eggs hatch again, the tadpoles will fall into the water and have a free swimming life. So the foam nests are a particularity of the gliding frogs. And again, the foam actually acts as extra moisture. So amphibians need really wet areas for the eggs to remain healthy. And so the foam acts as a layer of proof that keeps the eggs moist. But having spoken about all these frogs that lay eggs that then lead to tadpoles which swim in the water, is the group of bush frogs. And bush frogs are crazy because you know how I was talking about in the beginning that frogs are this intermediate of fish and reptiles because they need water to complete their life cycle. Well, this group has adapted to completely miss that part. So the eggs that they lay directly hatch into little frogs. So if you look at this picture on the right, is inside the egg, you actually see a tiny frog, not a tadpole. And what's amazing about this is that a bush frog is a terrestrial frog, which means it's opened up land for it, right? Like it doesn't have to compete with other species for water resources. And it can now take over land areas where it can colonize and use habitats that other species are incapable of using throughout the year because it doesn't need water for any part of its life cycle. So that's an incredible feat, I think, that they have these direct developing eggs that can directly turn into frogs and don't have to have a tadpole stage. And within bush frogs is an even crazier subgroup that are these frogs that live almost entirely in a bamboo species called Aucklandra reeds. And they have the most stunning eyes that of any frog I've ever seen, all of them. Like they have such beautiful, like a few examples here. And these frogs are all distributed across the Western Ghats. And they manage to somehow live their entire lives within these Aucklandra reeds. Like they probably spend most of their year anyway hibernating like all frogs. But come monsoon, they're out on the leaf and stem areas calling, looking for mates. But what happens when they find a mate is that, as you know, reeds are hollow, like all grasses and bamboos and things, they're hollow inside. So they find little crevices and gaps in the stems of the bamboo, and they get into it, and they actually lay their eggs within those hollow bamboo stems. And that's incredible because it provides perfect safety. Like what predator will ever be able to get to those eggs, right? There's nothing likely except maybe insects and other kind of pest attacks. Like no big predator can actually get to those frogs ever. And again, like all other bush frogs, they can survive without water, and when they hatch, they come out as little frogs like this. That's an incredible group of frogs. And then there's tadpole adaptation, which is even crazier, right? It's almost like the same species has two completely different body forms. And tadpoles have such crazy adaptations too, because they're almost like little independent units. This is a species of a horned frog from Northeast India. And horned frogs have such crazy looking tadpoles. Like, look at this. They have these, their lips or labia, they kind of swollen into these funnel shaped structures. And they use this to funnel feed through the water. And the funnel actually traps like everything from debris and dust to like food particles of other small unicellular animals and things like that. And that's what they eat. So they have these crazy oral, like mouth adaptation to survive in water and feed in water. Another tadpole that has a crazy adaptation is of the leaping frogs, the Indirana genus from the Western Ghats again. And these guys are sort of in between, like I told you about frogs that have tadpoles that need water, and then frogs that have direct froglets from their eggs. But the Indirana is a unique group where the tadpole is terrestrial, so semi-terrestrial at least. So when the tadpoles hatch normally with other frogs, they don't have legs. They're just like a little blob of a head and a tail. But Indirana tadpoles actually have hind limbs straight out of hatching. And they live on wet rock surfaces across the Western Ghats. And just the fact that in the monsoon, rock surfaces are so wet and slippery, somehow that water seems to be enough for them to survive in. And over time, they just live there, and then they develop forelimbs and then become adults. So yeah, this is a unique bridge between a direct developer and a regular frog that has a tadpole stage that lives entirely in water. But you also asked me if there are adaptations we don't yet know about. And this is probably one of those mysteries to me. This is, I think it has a stupid common name like black narrow-mouthed frog or some rubbish like that. But I think it should be called a starry sky frog. I mean, look at it, right? It's this incredibly black frog with white and blue spots all over its body. To me, that looks like the night sky. So I propose that we call this the starry sky frog. But although it's almost entirely black and blue and white, on the surface, if you flip it over on the underside, for some reason, its thighs and its armpits are bright orangish red in color. And we don't know what the hell it is for. Like, is it signaling? Is it some kind of adaptation that helps them with breathing? Is it like some species of reptiles, for instance, store carotenoids, which are really high proteinaceous substances. And actually in the weak periods where there isn't enough food, when they're hibernating, things like that, they use the proteins from these bright spots for survival. So whether it's an adaptation like that, we don't know what the hell it's for. But what's crazy is, like I said, most frogs use auditory communication, oral communication. So they have to be good listeners too. And almost all the photos, if you see, there's a clear tympanum, a eardrum behind the eye, and that's what they use to listen to calls. But this species doesn't have a eardrum, does not call, and seems to spend most of its life living deep inside fallen logs. So how the hell do they even find mates and reproduce is a complete mystery. And it's such a rare frog. Like, it's not got a very small distribution. It's reasonably well distributed across the southern Western Ghats, but it has such a specific microhabitat requirement, lives in such hard to access places that very few people have ever seen this frog. Like, probably a few handfuls of people and less than those many pictures. So we really have no idea how this animal communicates, reproduces, finds mates. It's fascinating. Yeah, that's my answer for adaptations.
Cool. Yeah, thanks a lot. In fact, under my house in Manipal, where the water from the bathroom would seep, I used to have Indirana tadpoles living there, and I found it really cool that they found an alternative to wet rocks.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Taps was a habitat I didn't know. Indirana was adapted to.
Of course, you mentioned climate change earlier, but what does the future for all of these frogs really look like in terms of the threats, in terms of just, are there any bright sides to it? You could elaborate on that.
Well, I hope there are. So, as I had already said, India has about 4 to 5% of land area that's protected in national parks and wildlife sanctuaries and tiger reserves and all of that. So that, and luckily, most of those do coincide with the most biodiverse regions, right? So the Western Ghats, unlike the rest of Indian average, has over 9% of protected area. So more of its habitat is protected. But on the flip side, a lot of amphibians don't necessarily have large distributions inside tiger reserves. And so habitat loss is the biggest threat, I would imagine, to amphibians right now. And just the amount of change we do, particularly to water bodies, dams, mines, and the pollution that that leads to, and the isolation of habitats and fragmentation that it creates, all of that. And we're seeing more and more of that across India right now. So that's a huge problem. Also, like if you look at Northeast India, we don't have too many protected areas in that landscape to start with. And secondly, there's very little protection. So habitat loss is rampant, but more importantly, hunting is rampant. So all of these problems do compound. That's a huge threat. And the other, I think, big one that I've already spoken about is climate change. We can save all the habitats we can protect as much of land as we want, but it's not going to stop that land from getting warmer, drier, hotter, more fires, more floods, more droughts. This is going to be the reality from, it's already begun, right? Like every year we're seeing more erratic rainfall patterns than before. So climate change, I think, unless as a species, human beings, does something about it, is going to be a difficult one to crack and hard for amphibians to adapt to.
Yeah, no, that's true. One of the things when I moved to Australia that I was often talked about was amphibian die-offs because of the chytrid fungus, which wasn't a significant topic in India, at least while I was looking at amphibians there. Where does India stand in the global context of this fungus? What exactly is this fungus? And how does it affect frogs?
Yeah. So there's this nasty little fungus called Batrachochytridium dendrobatidis. And this wretched fungus has basically led to mass die-offs across the world. And like, I think particularly badly affected is Central and South America, where literally I think 30% of amphibians have gone extinct over the last 20, 30 years. And it's been absolutely depressing, right? You see entire landscapes with just all frogs dying, and it's horrible. What actually happens is that amphibians, unlike most other vertebrates, breathe through their skin, and they need really moist skin and for oxygen and exchange into the body. And what this fungus does is it attacks the skin and dries it up, and they're not able to breathe. And then it, like literally, there are horror pictures of spores of the fungus growing out of their body, and it shuts down their hearts, it kills them pretty quick. And because it's on their skin surface, literally any surface they've been on, whether land or water, now has the spores of this fungus, and it spreads really rapidly through the environment and causes massive die-offs. But what's happened, if you look at like a global map from one of the papers that I found on how prevalent this fungus is around the world, for some reason there's an almost entire blank across most of Asia. When you look at like North and South America and Europe, Africa, Australia, everywhere else, there's like a much higher prevalence of the disease, and the odds of this disease overtaking entire landscapes and species. I think with the Indian research scenario, people have been working on the Chytridium situation. But from what I understand, what they found is that there is chytrid, particularly in the Western Ghats. I think some species of Vejavaria, the cricket frogs, and Indiranas, leaping frogs, and the Indo-Silveranas, the golden frogs, all of them have found evidence of having the chytrid fungus. But I think it seems to be a native strain of chytrid fungus. So any disease that's native has been around in existence in these populations for long enough that these species have immunity to it. The amphibians are able to resist the disease. Some might succumb, some might die, but at the population level, you'd expect that most amphibians are able to defend themselves from the disease through natural immunity. But what happens is if a new strain of chytrid comes from somewhere else, so suppose if we have a chytrid come into like strain come in from the neotropics or from Japan or Australia, we're in for serious trouble, right? Like that particular strain, none of the amphibians in India would ever have built immunity towards. So it can wipe out all our frogs in absolutely no time, which is a depressing thought. But if you look at the times we're in right now, we're in the middle of a pandemic with, I don't know, I'm sitting in the hotbed with over 1 lakh deaths in the US, but so many people dying everywhere. India crossed 2.5 lakhs yesterday, I think. And one of the main reasons this happened is because of how much human beings travel now. We get everywhere across the world, and therefore the disease can spread quickly. And unfortunately, we also take along animal diseases across the world. So if we do, God forbid, bring some new strain of chytrid to India, we don't know what's going to happen. And think about it, it's not just human beings traveling, but also the amount of goods that travel. So there's like timber and other forms of stuff that's moving across the seas. Our ports are probably easily vulnerable to something like this. And I think recently there was that discovery of a microhyla from Mangalore, whose nearest relative was somewhere in Indonesia or Malaysia or something like that. And there's a theory that it actually is probably not native to India, but was brought in through timber export. And so it was found predominantly in a timber depot, right? So along with something like that, what if a chytrid comes in? Like, we won't even know. So actually there's this other chytrid that affects salamanders specifically, B-sal, and it's already prevalent in Europe, unfortunately, killing a lot of salamanders there. But if you look at the amount of research that's being done in North America, even before B-sal reaches North America, like researchers are actually actively out there looking for it, trying to figure out which species, which landscapes are susceptible, what can we do to prevent an outbreak. Like, there's already active research on a disease that's not even there yet, but might because Europe has it. But there's very little. I mean, India has had a few spurts of research on the chytrid, but nothing to the scale that's happening here. So if we have an outbreak, it would probably be so silent and quick that it'll be too late for us to do much by the time it lands.
Yeah, not a very happy thought. So I'm going to try thanks for that. I'm going to try to shift the conversation a bit. I just want to ask you about something that interests you, and maybe a twofold question. How do humans and frogs interact? And what do frogs give to humans, and what do we give to them? I know this is a question that particularly interests you. It's kind of where your interests lie. And also, what is the status of research on frogs in India in general?
Okay. So for the first part of the question is, amphibians actually are such a big part of not just like the natural pristine environment that we envision inside like forests, but just our everyday lives, right? If you think about India, where over 60% agrarian, 62% of India falls under some form of agriculture. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this yourself. Like if you've just been to like a paddy field in the monsoon, it's like there's a giant motor in your ears because there's just so many frogs calling simultaneously. There's such a huge part of human landscapes that we have a lot of interaction going on that we're unaware of. And unlike like the larger bodied animals, like mammals or birds, these guys are small, right? But they're in such high abundance that their biomass is huge. And there is no estimate for what a tropical biomass of amphibians looks like. And just imagine how many insects those many amphibians must be consuming. So for an agrarian country like India, that's a huge pest control device, like all these frogs eating those many insects. They provide this incredible ecosystem service. Like, instead of, imagine how much more pesticide we'll have to use if amphibians didn't exist in the world. So there's a form of indirect interaction that positively benefits us directly. And actually, the picture I showed you about the chited, where there was all the dead frogs, there was a recent paper that came out that showed that because those many frogs went extinct, species diversity of snakes have rapidly dropped in many parts of the world that experience chited. So lack of amphibians is going to lead to a lot more ecosystem chaos than we recognize. They are such an important part of the food chain. So one, they consume all these insects. Two, they're consumed by all these snakes, which again is a very important part of this entire food cycle. And I think the more we can find ways to coexist with amphibians, the better it'll be for us. And in my opinion, that's really not hard. It's not something we need to fight, because if you think about it, a lot of India's goals and requirements actually match with the frogs. Our biggest resource threat is water. Fresh water is India's most scarce resource. We saw the summer of last year, 2019, being probably the worst drought in a really long time. Parts of South India was so dry. And I remember, like, even Mumbai and Chennai and things were so far out of water that if it didn't rain in, like, I don't know, 10 or 15 days, the city had to be shut down or evacuated or something like that. It was crazy. The monsoon came, we got lucky. But like I said, with climate change, droughts are going to become more frequent, longer, and harder than ever before. So what we need is freshwater conservation. We need fresh water for us. And that's what the frogs need. They need fresh water. So we have the same requirements. So there is no conflict, right? In that way. So if we conserve habitats for us, we conserve habitats for them. And so I think that's something we all have to work towards. And that's what I'm trying to do with my PhD. I'm looking at how amphibian communities differ across tea, coffee, agro-plantations, and the surrounding forests. And I'm trying to see what management practices land managers are using to grow their crops, but that can also best sustain amphibian populations. And can we incentivize, can we find ways that land managers can continue to use such practices, or start adapting and adopting these practices so that we have sustained freshwater resources and amphibian populations? Oh, you also asked me a second question, right? About the...
Generally, what is it? What in your opinion, maybe a short answer of what's the state of research and conservation of frogs in India?
Right. So, well, I think Indian amphibian research is in its nascence. Like, it's an emerging field, in my opinion. If you look at most of India's research over the last couple of decades, it's mostly been taxonomy. It's trying to figure out, is species A different from species B? Or if I call this species A, is it actually a bunch of different species? And that's all the research that's being done, which is great, because we didn't even know what the hell we had in India. What was the diversity of India? How many species did we have? And so that's great. It's great that we're doing all this taxonomy work to first figure out what is there. But the second thing now to start doing is simultaneously, hopefully, given that we have all these new species that are being described, what do we know about their distribution? What do we know about their habitat use? What do we know about their co-occurrence and competition patterns, their behaviors like mate selection, reproduction, things like that? Like, which times of the year are they seasonality? So what is the most active breeding season? Like, unless we know these things, we can't do much to conserve them. And I think it's time we start upping the ecological research around amphibians, because yes, it's great that we're finding out what new species there are, but we need to go far beyond that, and quickly. Like, the work I see collaborators doing here in the US is insane. They ask such specific questions about, like, dispersal abilities, for instance, how far individual amphibians are able to move. We know nothing about stuff like that. The biomass of how many amphibians we have, population size, we know nothing about these things. And I think those are really interesting questions to now start asking, now that we have some idea, at least in the Western Ghats, of what frogs there are. And I think to lead to good research, you need a good community of researchers to do that. And I think globally we're trying to do that. We're trying to diversify research communities, which can then lead to better research, I think. And for instance, until recently, you didn't find too many women herpetologists who did ecological research. And I'm glad to see more and more that there are young people, particularly girls, who are happening to now study amphibians, and that's exciting. And I think if we can be more collaborative about everything we do, we can get to better research. I mean, if you look at the birding community in India, it's far better knit, and there's so many more opportunities for people to exchange ideas, exchange experiences. You have all these sites like eBird and things like that, and just on social media platforms, but you also have like talks like this that Delhibird Foundation organizes, which is amazing, right? And I think we need more of that collaborative spirit in the amphibian world so that we can get to better research and eventually to better conservation of frogs. You've muted.
Yeah, sorry. No, that's very true. And along the same lines, so I'm sure a lot of people want to be looking at frogs, and want to get to a level where they can share their observations and look at all these interesting things about them. What would your suggestions be for budding frog enthusiasts out there?
You should be able to answer this question as well as me at this point, or most of what you asked me, I think. But basically, most of you watching and listening to this, I'm sure, are already naturalists of some stripe or the other, and you've been out there watching whatever you watch, birds, butterflies, mammals. And I think the key is essentially to be out there and watch. And unlike with the other stuff, though, you have to be out at night. But frogs are everywhere, right? Like whether you're an urban city dweller or a more suburban or rural dweller, you essentially have to get out towards the closest water body near you, even if it's just a lily pond somewhere, when it has rained, and you're gonna find frogs. So they're pretty easy to find in some ways if you're just out in wet areas looking for them. So the next time it rains, take out your flashlights at night, just after dusk, and go look for frogs in whatever the closest, wettest area you have is. And that's going to show you a lot of frogs. Also, if many of the listeners are birders, the incredible thing about frogs is this is something I would have never thought of. And this is, I think, something most frog biologists don't intuitively go towards, but actually came out of our first field experience with Ramit and Shashank, is as birders, they tuned into the call of the frogs so quickly. Like, it was incredible. We were walking through coffee estates in Chikmagalur, and within no time, they were like, oh, tuberohumerus, oh, luteolus. Like, they were just able to pick calls so quickly after a few days of listening, because that's what birders do. They use their ears to like detect animals, birds. And so if you use the same technique with frogs, every frog has a pretty unique calling pattern. And that's what you need to know. Like if you keep listening in along with visually looking for them, you're going to start learning that they have unique calls. And that's very useful in us for a second reason, that many frogs that are commonly found in urban landscapes, we actually don't know, like Fajavarias. They're so hard. Like, what the hell Fajavaria are you looking at? They all look the same, right? Like, you're not going to be able to ID them to the species level in many places. But if you start listening to them, maybe if you have more than one Fajavaria, you might be able to tell them apart auditorily. So yeah, those are basically keep your eyes open and ears open and on a wet night. And I think that's all the answer I have for it.
Pretty good. Thanks a lot, Vishnu. Actually, that's a lot of information. I'm sure for a lot of us. I would just like to open the floor to others, and if you can just send in your questions to add to this wealth of information that Vishnu's given us today.
I
And
have
just like,
one thing to do though before that. Nick, do you want me to post the quiz question now or
Yeah,
after?
sure. Yeah, sure.
Huh? Okay, let's do that. Here's the question of the day. Okay. What species of frog is endemic to the Western Ghats, lives on treetops, has skin like lichen, and sounds like a falling water drop? Are they expected to write down the answers on the chat?
No answer in the chat, please. Please put it on this website down there, and you can win these prizes given below.
Okay.
So any questions now? We'll take questions.
Great. I missed out on the name of the frog that you mentioned in response to the question on adaptation. Oh, the starry night frog. So the scientific name is Baracus indicus, and I think the common name is black narrow-mouthed frog. So the thing with frogs is that common names are really misleading and confusing because there are so many local names depending on where you are that it's not standardized. So most of us use scientific names for frogs. So do you want me to type out the name maybe in the chat so that people have the spelling? There you go. That's it. Any other questions?
we have a question from Facebook by Janki Turaga. What is the frogs diversity in paddy fields and areca gardens of the Western Ghats?
Well, you'd find almost all of the regular terrestrial ground dwelling frogs that are pretty well adapted in paddy fields. So like I said, they'll largely be generalists in my opinion. You'll find your bullfrogs and your toads, but you'll also find like a bunch of like microhyla, narrow-mouthed frogs. You'll find Fejavarias, Indosilveranas, Indiranas, essentially the kind of frogs that use stagnant freshwater to breed in. So Euphlyctus might also be found if there's enough waterlogging. Any species that uses stagnant water and is more likely to be a generalist than not is what you'd probably find in paddy fields. Areca, on the other hand, also have a lot of generalist bush frogs. So for instance, I think a lot of areca have pepper vines going around the stem. So Pseudophylotus was a frog that we found in pretty much every areca estate. But even like Rauchistus tuberohumerus, or what are the other common ones? Occasionally we found luteolus as well, right?
Yeah, one of the things I really liked about areca plantations was that when the big leaves would fall down, under the leaves, there would often be they would be collected water, and you would find even things like Nyctibatrachus.
Right. That's true. And then like areca also has these little, like they've dug out trenches, like long trenches between rows of areca that are almost like these secondary streamlets. So these Nyctibatrachus campholensis, the little guy, yeah, he was everywhere in the areca plantations.
Yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, it's amazing. There's even in such intensively man-made environments, you find fairly incredible diversity of frogs.
Yeah.
I have more. There are more questions for you, Vishnu. If you want to read them, just go ahead. Yeah.
One more clarification. What was the frog that did the handstand? The handstand that I showed you, that was Batrachus grandis. I'm gonna type in that answer too. There you go. How do cricket frogs adapt to Deccan Plateau and Western Ghats conditions? They're typical ground dwelling frogs, right? So, and they're pond breeding, usually stagnant water breeding frogs as well. So the Western Ghats is so wet. It rains so much in the monsoon that every road track, like a mud road that has a vehicle going through, is going to form ruts. It's going to fill up with water in the monsoon, and even that much water is enough for like species like Fejavarya to breed in. They're basically really good at adapting to any kind of habitat. And the Deccan Plateau, of course, is much drier, but even there are sufficient stagnant water bodies that they breed in, and that's how they're able to adapt to like wet conditions and the Ghats and the dry conditions in the plateau. Any idea of how many species are found in urban areas on an average? What's NCR?
National Capital Region.
Oh,
Delhi.
right.
Yes.
Did not think about that. Oh, Delhi. Okay, it says Delhi. Right. Yeah. In Delhi, I would like 10 to 12 species of common frogs around the capital, I'm sure. Mostly you will find, like I said, the toad. You will find a couple of species of toads. There's Dattatreya stomaticus as well there.
Yep.
There's the Indian bullfrog, a few species of Fejavarya, Euphlyctus, skittering frogs. You'll find Microhyla, I guess.
Yep.
You'll find Euperodon, both globosus and cystoma.
Yes, both.
And you might find Spherotheca. Yeah, those are the ones on top of my head.
There was a poster, I think, from JNU that released with a list of frogs to find in NCR. You might have to Google it, but you'll find it, I think so.
Yeah. I think there was a question for you as well, Ramit, about the status in Australia. I don't know, research status in Australia.
I don't know. Yeah, sorry, no idea. Cool. I think that's all the questions.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Vishnu.
Thanks,
that was
fun.
Yeah, thank you, Amit, for taking this, and thank you, Vishnu, for taking us to this fascinating world of frogs. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everybody for joining us. And do come in tomorrow at 5 o'clock. We have Nishant, who will be talking about black kites to us. See you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.